This may feel a little strange.
I bought Ghostrunner on a complete whim with zero expectations that I would be getting a good game. All I knew going in was that Ghostrunner was a first-person cyberpunk ninja game. And I feel like based on those user-generated tags that this game was engineered specifically to appeal to my interests. When you make a video game about a cyborg ninja, it's kind of implicitly understood that your game has to have good movement, a solid combat system, and a fast pace. So does Ghostrunner deliver on its premise? Well, for the most part, yes. And out of all the options I just listed, this game over-delivers in the speed department. Ghostrunner is hands down one of the fastest games I have ever played, and this is coming from somebody that deliberately looks for fast-paced games. Just a heads up, but this is one of those games that was intended to be played with a keyboard and a mouse. Not only does Ghostrunner play at a high speed, but it also requires pinpoint precision platforming, and you do this all in first person. The bulk of your movement options come from controlling the camera, and a thumbstick just isn't as fast or as accurate as a mouse. To be honest, I'm more of a gamepad player myself, but for this review, I decided to make an exception to the rule, and I played the game the way the developers intended. Getting used to the control scheme was a bit of a hurdle for me, but towards the end of the game, and on my second playthrough, I began to get the hang of it. So pretty much everything you need to know about the premise for Ghostrunner plays in the intro cutscene. You play as a Ghostrunner, which is this universe's version of a cyborg ninja. And you are motivated by revenge after Mara, that's the woman you see in the intro cutscene, rips off your arm and then throws you off a skyscraper, which is pretty metal. And really, that's all the context you need for the game. Ghostrunner is a gameplay over story experience. Now, there is a story to be enjoyed here, but most of the meat is all in the gameplay. The gameplay loop in Ghostrunner can be divided into two segments. In most levels, you will be running through first-person parkour challenges, only to then be walled off by an arena that must be cleared of enemies. It's important to note that Ghostrunner is one of those one-hit death games with little room for error. That may sound a little overboard at first, but there are plenty of checkpoints, and you respawn instantaneously with zero loading screens. The lack of loading screens and instant respawn kept me invested in the gameplay, but keep in mind that this is still a challenging game. There were some levels so hard that I died over 100 times. The difficulty is also offset thanks to this game's phenomenal synthwave soundtrack. Let me explain. A good soundtrack can go a long way in enhancing your gameplay experience. The original release of Nier had mediocre combat but was elevated thanks to the music. Likewise for Ghostrunner, the difficulty hump isn't as much of a problem when you're jamming to a good soundtrack. For me personally, there is something about the combination of synthwave and a difficult game that puts me in a trance where I lose my sense of time and the game has my full attention. It's a dangerous combination. The player is hooked by the challenge the game presents and then lulled into a trance by complementary music. That to me feels like the purest definition of immersion. The parkour runs I found to be extremely rewarding. This is where the game shines its brightest and lives up to its premise of playing as a cyborg ninja. As the Ghostrunner, you can wall run, swing from a grapple beam, and slide down slopes at a fast pace. You also have a useful dash move that can slow down time for a few seconds if you use it in midair. If you're ever in a tight spot, just slow down time and then change your trajectory. Given how fast this game is, slowing down time for a few seconds is a godsend for new players. Speedrunners, on the other hand, are going to want to avoid this mechanic for obvious reasons. The parkour segments are expertly crafted to make good use of all the Ghostrunner's abilities. You will switch from bouncing off of walls to swinging off a grapple point all on the fly. There was this moment where I had to slow down time in order to both avoid a dead end and find a hidden grapple point. The developers at Slipgate Ironworks went out of their way to make sure the player made full use out of the Ghostrunner's moveset. All of these acrobatic maneuvers are done while blitzing past gorgeous environments, and it does more to flesh out this game's atmosphere than any story content ever could. There was a moment in the game where I reached the Dharma Tower's upper levels. The scenery switched from a depressing industrial metal plant to a bright and vibrant neon city. There was this moment when I was wall running off a bright neon billboard while dodging bullets that I thought to myself, this is just pure cyberpunk. The parkour segments show off how beautiful this game really is. When you jet through the city, while also in the first person, you really do feel a connection to the character you're playing as. It almost felt like I was in a simulation of what it's like to be a cyborg ninja. That's just how immersed I was in the game. But that's just one half to the puzzle that is Ghostrunner. The other half of the game is the combat arenas and the combat system itself. You'll know you're in a combat arena when the door won't open in front of you until all the enemies around you are dead. In my opinion, this is where the bulk of the game's challenge comes from. Good reflexes and timing aren't enough to get through these segments. Some of the areas you'll be fighting in look like a skate park for the player's style in. Others are glorified death traps more deadly than the enemies shooting back at you. The player not only has to factor in the map layout and the enemy placement, they also have to plan their own route to victory. Some routes might be harder but faster, others might be easier but slower. The player has to make all of these life and death choices in mere milliseconds, armed only with a sword. I'd say 90% of the combat in Ghostrunner is melee combat. Now, there is one other context-sensitive range weapon, but it's unavailable for most of the game. You can deflect enemy bullets right back at them, but that's just as hard and as mental as it sounds. Bullet deflection is this game's version of a Royal Guard. It's an advanced counter move that leaves you open for damage, and in this case, damage means death. You'll get the most out of this gameplay mechanic on repeat playthroughs when you already understand enemy movements and timing. You do have a special move that can wipe out whatever's in front of you, but other than that, you're stuck with your good old katana for most of the game. This melee-focused approach to combat will affect the way you take out enemies. Some enemies are shielded and can only be outflanked from behind, others are wide open for bullet deflection. There's even another ninja-type enemy that has to be countered before they're killed. The variety of enemies you'll be fighting just adds layers onto an already difficult challenge. Certain types of enemies will change the way you plan out your routes. For example, the sniper is easy to kill, the challenging part is just getting close to him. So with all the praise being said, I do have some criticisms about the game. Ghostrunner is a game primarily focused on platforming and sword combat. And if I'm going to be objective here, the game would have played much better from a third-person perspective. A big problem with first-person platforming is that you can't see your character in relation to whatever you're jumping towards. There's at least 10% guesswork in every jump you make. Over time, that percent can lower if you get good at the game, but it's still an issue nonetheless. The first-person perspective also means that the player has to always have pinpoint accuracy controlling the camera. Alright, for example, when the player does a wall run, they are expected to point the camera on a 45-degree angle to see whatever's in front of them. This is a skill in its own right. If you don't move the camera on time, you'll face plant into whatever's in front of you. Okay, now for a second here, let's just compare this game to Cloudbuilt, which is an indie game that is debatably even faster than Ghostrunner. Cloudbuilt also has parkour platforming, but this time you do it in the third person where camera control is less of an issue. Since you can actually see your character in relation to whatever you're jumping towards, there's no guesswork for any of the jumps you make. If you fell into a pit, that's all on you for making a bad judgment call. Wall running also works better since the player doesn't have to waste any mental energy controlling the camera. The developers even went out of their way to have the option to toggle to a different camera angle while you perform a vertical wall run. Ghostrunner is a game that requires split-second life and death decisions. And those decisions are harder to make when you also have to focus on manipulating the camera. Cloudbuilt has those same split-second decisions, but without any of the camera issues, the player is free to focus on the challenge in front of them. Just some food for thought here. So I'm not the first person to say this, but the only other flaw in Ghostrunner is the boss fights. So spoiler warnings, you have been warned. Ghostrunner is a one-hit death game for both the players and the enemies you're facing. Since that's a level playing field, the game feels fair. Boss fights, on the other hand, break this rule and get a health bar. It also seems to me that designing a boss fight in a one-hit death game was challenging for the developers. There's only 3 boss fights in total, and only one out of those 3 I would argue is even good. The first boss fight is completely unnotable and doesn't even feel like a fight. It's more like a death trap with a health bar glued onto it. The player just has to climb up the tower while avoiding lasers. I also think that this is one of the hardest fights in the game and is way too early as it is. Now, the second boss fight is actually kind of good. You fight a lady Ghostrunner in a one-on-one sword fight, and I kind of dig that. For this one fight, the game almost shifts genres. If you've played Sekiro before, this combat system will be familiar to you. To land a hit on the boss, you need to break your guard by blocking all her strikes right before they land. The only downside to this system is that it's the only time the player is really expected to fight this way. It's clear that the ninja enemies were created to train the player to counter sword strikes. The problem is that they only have one attack, and it's not enough to prepare you for the upcoming boss fight. The boss, on the other hand, has a long string of combos the player has to parry. Personally, I immediately picked up on the mechanic because it reminded me so much of Sekiro. In all honesty though, most new players will probably find this boss fight confusing. Other than that, I enjoyed the fight because it's a one-on-one sword duel and that's hard to mess up. Now the final boss was a huge letdown. The whole game builds Mara up to be this overpowered nightmare. Like, think about it. The game starts with her defeating you by simply pressing a button. She then rips off your arm and then throws you off of a building. But when you actually get to her, the whole fight can be summed up as waiting for my turn. You'll have to wait 30 seconds at a time for Mara to finish her attack combos. Then the game will be generous and let you have a turn to hit her back. And that's all there is to the fight. If you messed up any time during that fight, you have to play the waiting game all over again. So yes, the boss fights need to be reworked. Now there is potential for boss fights to be good, but as it stands, they are mostly a blemish on an otherwise good game. I've saved this story for the end of the review because it's hands down the least important part of the game. Like I said at the start of the review, this is a gameplay over a story experience. Now, I'm not saying that Ghostrunner has a bad story. There's just no way a game this fast can have enough time to let a plot marinate the same way it can in a slower paced game like Deus Ex could. Every level in Ghostrunner has hidden items and audio logs that help flesh out the story. Now, in a game like Dark Souls, reading item descriptions and piecing together the story takes a bit of time, and that flows together nicely with a slower combat system. But when I'm playing a game as fast as Ghostrunner, I want to jump right back into the gameplay. And that's ultimately why I think Ghostrunner is a good game. Ghostrunner is a difficult game that had a huge learning curve for me. And to be honest, I wasn't that good at it. But I don't think player skill is the only way to judge if a game is good or not. I think what's more important to ask is, do I want to be good at this game? And for me, that's a yes. While there are some problems with first-person platforming, the gameplay itself is good. Ghostrunner plays great, looks gorgeous, and has a godlike soundtrack. When you put all those factors in a blender, you end up with a game that's so addicting you can lose your sense of time. And the game's not that expensive, so why the hell not?